So, good morning. I hope you're well. Welcome to your history lesson. Mrs. O'Reilly and Miss Berger had a meeting last week and we were deciding what to do. And normally at this time of the year, we would be doing less English and maths and more kind of project work, maybe history that we haven't done for a while before the SATs. So, because Black Lives Matter protests have been in the news recently all around the world, we thought you might be interested in the history of that, where that all comes from and how we've come to be where we are today. So, as you know, I have a lot to say about history. It could be some time. And also I've made some notes. If I keep glancing off to the side, it's because I don't want to forget to say anything that I've already said. Okay? Let's make a move. We're going to look at the civil rights movement. And before that, we'll be looking at the history of the civil rights movement before it became the civil rights movement. How did we come to a position where African Americans started to fight for their rights? What was missing from their lives that they felt they needed to do that? So, first of all, I'd like you to look at this picture. Can you think of some three questions maybe that you'd like to ask about this image? So stop the video, maybe have a good look at it, see what you think it shows. Okay, so what this image shows are some water fountains. Now, these aren't very common now. They used to be quite common when I was at school, where you press a lever and the water comes out. I know you'll have seen them, but they just used to be everywhere, particularly in the 1950s and 60s. So this is one in America. You can see the big one says over it white, and the little round one over here on the left-hand side says coloured. And that's because drinking fountains weren't allowed to be shared by white and black people. Now, coloured was the name that was given to black people in those days, and it meant anybody who wasn't white. We wouldn't use that phrase today, so please don't, because it's considered quite offensive. You can use person of colour, is a word that you could use, but coloured, because it has these connotations of being associated with this era, is definitely not a word that we would use today. But if you look at this, so not only were they separate, they had to use separate drinking fountains. You can see that the white one is vastly superior to the one for the coloured people, for the black people. You can see that it's much smaller, not so nice, etc. Okay, so these are, can you see that at the bottom? These are the key words that we're going to learn about today. We've got, what you can't see, I don't think, is I've got some little video controls covering it up, but I think we've got segregation, civil rights, the Jim Crow laws, race, and disenfranchisement. Okay, so first of all, I'd like you to stop the video, have a look up what segregation, civil rights, disenfranchisement mean. Okay, so I think we know what race is. That's what race you are. It relates to your racial heritage and where you were born and where your parents were born. And Jim Crow laws we will get onto. But if we look at civil segregation, segregation means that where you were separating people because of their race, religion, or culture. Okay, civil rights is the right of citizens to political freedom and equality. And disenfranchisement means that you are deprived, that means stopped, from using your right or privilege, especially the right to vote. So we normally use it in relation to people's right to vote. So if you are disenfranchised, it means you have no right to vote. Okay? So that comes up quite a lot in American elections. People will say that they feel disenfranchised. That means they haven't got the right, they've got the right to vote, but something is stopping them in the American system. Okay, and we've got a little extension thing at the bottom. Can you think of any examples today where people are segregated? Again, stop the video. See if you can think of anything. I'm just going to pause mine there as well. Okay, so moving on. Not like that, not. Okay, so these are the keywords that we're going to find out about and learn about today. So I'd like to stop the video, go away and find out about the meaning of segregation, civil rights and disenfranchisement. We've got other words there, which are race and Jim Crow laws, and we'll talk about those in a moment. Okay, so you've come back. Obviously, we know what a person's race is. It's where you descend from a common ancestry or from a particular place, and you share physical characteristics with the people who are all from that place. Jim Crow laws we're going to talk about in a little while. So here are some of the key words, hopefully you found these. Segregation is the separating of people because of their race, religion or culture. So that means keeping people separate because either their race, their religion or their culture. And civil rights means the right of citizens, so people who live in a place, to political freedom and equality. And disenfranchisement is being deprived of a right or a privilege, and it especially applies to the right to vote. So if you are stopped from voting, you are disenfranchised. Okay, so disenfranchisement is being deprived of a right or privilege, especially the right to vote. So can you think of anywhere today where people are segregated? Okay, so you may not know much about this, but for example, in South Africa before the 1980s, 1990s, people were segregated in exactly the same way as they were in America in the 1950s and 60s. And that only came to an end when Nelson Mandela became president. During that whole process of him becoming president, there are some people, the Rohingya, who are treated separately in the world, in their country in Burma, and in Myanmar, sorry, and you probably have thought of some of your own. Okay, so we're looking at America primarily because we're looking at the American civil rights movement. I'm just going to say it's absolutely typical that just now, as I start this video, they've come to clean our wheelie bins. So I don't know if you can hear the noise, but it's really loud. So if I get distracted, that'll be why. Okay, so where is America? Well, I think we know that America is over here. Here's the United States. Here's us. And here is Africa. Okay, and the bit that we're really interested in is this bit of Western Africa here. Okay, these islands here, if you don't know, are the Caribbean islands. Okay. Okay. I just got a text message to say to clean my wheelie bin. Thank you very much. Now, you may know something about this because you should have done something about this in year 5, but you may not remember, or you may not have got to it in year 5. In the United States, sorry, slavery was really, originally it was quite widespread, but eventually it became so that it was only practiced in the southern states of America. So you can see that this map is split into slave states in green, which are in the southern bit of the country, and the pink states were called free states. So you've got places like New York, Massachusetts, etc. And on the left, on the west coast, you've got California. The ones in between didn't really declare either way, but the green ones were the only ones who really practiced slavery. Okay. So sorry, I should have said that in the south, some of those states you've got there are Georgia, Texas, Florida, North Carolina. Okay, so again, you should have done this in year 6, but just in case you didn't, here is the direction of the transatlantic slave trade. So I've got something to say about this. So if we look at this bit over here, let me just this bit. This is Britain. So slavery was abolished in the British Empire. As you know, we had conquered quite a few countries all over the world. And at first we used to practice slavery too. It was abolished in the British Empire in 1833 because of some campaigning British people who took it upon themselves to campaign against it. But it persisted in the United States until 1863. Of course, the United States used to be a colony of Britain. So we did take that practice over to America. The northern states made it illegal, but it was still used in the southern states, which is this one that we've just seen. The southern states still practice slavery. Okay, so slaves were used in the southern states, in these states here, to work large plantation farms, often picking cotton, and it made them the undisputed leader in cotton production all over the world. They originally picked sugar. That became quite uncompetitive, so they moved more into cotton, particularly when the new inventions such as the cotton gin and all the inventions that came from the Industrial Revolution made it quicker to pick the cotton and process it. They would then ship that over to Britain and the rest of Europe. And I'm sorry to say, even though we've done the Industrial Revolution, we didn't mention this aspect of it, but a lot of our wealth was created through the slave trade, particularly in cities like Liverpool and Bristol and London. Okay, so because there was a boom in cotton, I'm just referring to my notes, sorry. Because there was a boom in cotton, there was a spike in demand for enslaved workers in the fields. And although it was illegal, Americans continued to smuggle Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. And that's what used to happen. We're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so here's the explanation of the transatlantic slave trade in a bit more detail. Let me move that out of the way. So the first, oh, I've got those in the wrong order. Let me just go back and just escape that. I'm just going to pause and make that right so that you don't get the wrong idea. Okay, so this is an explanation of the transatlantic slave trade that we'll just concentrate on for the moment. Again, you should have seen this in year 5, and you probably did, but just in case you didn't, we'll just go over it. You can see that primarily we're looking at Great Britain, West Africa, and the Americas. So in stage 1 of the journey, which is the bit here, slave ships left British ports such as London, Liverpool, and Bristol, and they sailed to Africa, and this is West Africa. Okay, so on their journey, they carry goods They carry goods manufactured in Britain, such as cloth made from the cotton that was sent to them, guns, ironware, and drinks. So ironware is things made out of iron. They carried these things because those were the things that they could trade easily. Many people in Africa didn't have the capability to to create the goods that they were buying from the British ships. And so they relied on Britain with its industrial revolutionary past to be supplying those goods to them. When it got to the African coast here in West Africa, these goods were exchanged for men, women, and children who had been captured by African slave dealers. So the African slave dealers worked with some white people on the ships to capture African slaves. When they'd been kept, they were kept in places called barracoons, and this was sometimes, there were buildings that were sometimes known as the point of no return. You've probably heard that phrase, and that's where it comes from. Once you were in one of these, there was no way you were getting back out of it. So the slaves came from all over Africa. They weren't just from this small area of West Africa. They came from all over Africa. And I did write it down. I think the number was 12.5 million people. Yeah. 12.5 million Africans were captured and enslaved during this period. Okay, at stage 2, African slaves were loaded onto the British ships. They were crammed side by side onto wooden bunk beds and chained by the feet. They were then sailed across the Atlantic in a journey that lasted up to about 3 months, and they were unable to move. Obviously, in those circumstances, they weren't very well fed, they weren't very well watered. I've written down here that feces, which is urine and vomit, accumulated where they were sitting, because often the sea was quite rough, so you can imagine people were sick, and they weren't allowed out to go to the toilet or anything. So feces, urine and vomit accumulated underneath them, and often people caught diseases which spread like wildfire. About 1 in 10 slaves died before reaching America. 15%, 10 to 15% died. About 10% died, and some others were just thrown overboard if they were weak. So if you died on the journey, your body would be thrown overboard. They wouldn't bother to transport you all the way. What's the point? And some people that they weren't sure whether they would survive, or they looked like they wouldn't, or maybe they were dead, or maybe they thought they were dead, or they were just very ill. They just threw them overboard as well. Okay, and this section, this number 2 section here, is known as the Middle Passage. Okay. This is where slaves were originally taken from Africa to the Americas to work on sugar plantations. A lot of them were taken to the Caribbean down here. But then they started to work on cotton plantations. Cotton became the most successful crop, and they were shipped to Europe and sold, as in the cotton was shipped to Europe and sold. Okay, so then we get on to stage 3, which is over here in the Americas. The slaves were sold at auction in America. So in the last bit of the journey, although the slaves hadn't been fed very well, in the last bit of the journey, they were allowed up on deck to get some exercise. They were fed a little bit better to try and feed them up, because obviously the healthier looking a slave, the more robust looking a slave, the more money that the slave dealers would get for them. The slaves were sold at auction. The slave ships were then filled up with raw materials produced in America, such as sugar, cotton, timber, and tobacco, and they were sailed back across the Atlantic to Great Britain, where they were turned into the manufactured goods. And then it was the whole cycle would start again. The manufactured goods would leave Britain and go to West Africa, etc. Therefore, at each stage of this triangular journey, profits were earned for the traders. It was a very, very lucrative, that means it was a money-making exercise. Okay, I'm just gonna have a drink of tea because my throat's dry now. Okay. Here's a picture you've probably, if you did do this last year, you'll have seen this picture already. The Middle Passage. This is the ship that was used on the Middle Passage. You can see that's a plan of the lower deck with stowage of 292 slaves, and this is how they would be stored in. 130 of these were stowed under the shelves shown, that's the old way of saying shown, in figure B and figure 3. So this one here, these people underneath, these are the ones. Okay. Just give me a minute to have a look at that. Fairly disgusting that people were rammed in so tightly, and you can see why disease would spread in those circumstances. Okay, things didn't get much better once you reached America, unfortunately. Oops, we'll just go back, sorry. In fact, let's go to this slide. So you may have seen this in the news over the weekend. This is Bristol on Sunday just gone. You'll have seen the Black Lives Matter protest, and in Bristol on Sunday, a statue of Edward Colston, who lived in Bristol and worked in Bristol and based himself in Bristol, stood in the centre of Bristol for years and years. People have been protesting about this statue, trying to get it moved, because Edward Colston was a slave trader. He was also what's known as a philanthropist. So there are many people these days known as philanthropists. It's people who give money to charity or to try and help with charitable works. He set up schools, etc. But he was a slave trader. That's how he made his money, that he then gave away some of. But he was a very rich man. He also kept quite a lot of it for himself. So what happened at the Black Lives Matter protest on Sunday was that some people, they've been trying to negotiate a peaceful settlement to this for some time. They like I say, this statue's been there for a very long time. It's got a plaque on it which praises Edward Colston as being a good person to represent Bristol. And there'd been a lot of discussions over many years about maybe they could put a different plaque on it that said he was a slave trader, or that gave two sides of the story. He was a slave trader, although he did give some money away. But no one had got anywhere. So the people who were protesting took it upon themselves to remove the statue. If you look really closely at the photograph, and you can probably find footage of this on YouTube, you can see that there's a rope here. So they lashed the rope around and pulled it down. Then they dragged it over to the water, to the river in Bristol, and threw the statue in the river, which they thought was a fitting end to the statue, given that he made his money out of the slave trade and the slave boats. So this was met with a mixed reception. Lewis Hamilton, the racing driver, he was very happy about it. Slave trader Edward Colston statue pulled down. Our country honoured a man who sold African slaves. All statues of racist men who made money from selling a human being shall be torn down. Which one is next? Okay, so he's obviously very happy about it. Other people were saying that we shouldn't change history, that we should leave things up to stand as they are, and that people need to research and find out who these people are. Okay, so, The life of a slave once they arrived in America didn't get much better, as I'm sure you can imagine. Life was brutal and harsh. The slaves were often either taken in families or they got into a family when they got there, but they were frequently separated from their families. So even though you were bought when you arrived, you might then be sold on. And you might create a family unit, so you might have a wife and children. But slave owners at that stage wouldn't think twice about splitting the unit up, the family unit up. So dad might be sold to another family and the children would never see him again. Mum might be sold. Even the children might be sold when they got a little bit older. They worked extremely long hours out in the field, picking cotton, often up to 20 hours. Many things were an offence or against the rules for which they could be whipped. And for serious rule breakers, they could be branded or even suffer death. So branding was where you have a hot iron with some kind of symbol on the end. You put that in the fire until it was burning hot and then put it on somebody's skin. And this was a branding. They would carry that then for the rest of their lives. They worked also, so most slaves would work in the fields, even the women and sometimes the children. There were some house servants. They were mostly women, sometimes older. They might play with the children or cook and clean, etc. They also worked very long hours, but they were slightly better treated in that they often slept in nicer accommodation or looked after slightly better, but all things relative. Not as well as we would like to be looked after. However, in 1857, the Supreme Court of America ruled that Black people could never be citizens of the United States. This led to massive division. Why couldn't a Black person be a citizen of the United States? And it directly led to the election of Abraham Lincoln, who I'm sure you've heard of, who was a president of the United States. His surprise election triggered a civil war. So the slave-owning states, the ones in the South, knew that Abraham Lincoln was not in favour of slavery. They were very worried when he was elected, and he'd previously given a speech in favour of the abolition of slavery, and the Southern American states were quite worried. They declared independence from the United States. They decided they didn't want to be part of the United States of America. They were going to be a country on their own, just the slave-owning states. They joined together to form their own country, and they were called the Confederate States of America. Okay, so the American Civil War. On the left, you've got the Confederacy, and on the right, you've got what's called the Unionists. Now, we would call these the United States. These were the original United States. So what parts of America were they from? Well, the Confederacy were the southern states where slavery was still legal and slaves still worked on plantations. And what did they believe in? They believed that it was their right as states to decide whether slavery was legal. That would be a bit like Cheshire deciding that, I don't know, that everyone should drive on the right-hand side of the road instead of the left-hand side because they have the right. You know, states in America have quite strong rights of their own, and they believe that slavery ought to be one of the rights that they should be able to retain if they wanted to. They believed that the president didn't have the power to make this decision, that he couldn't abolish slaves. And this was a belief called states' rights. They believed in states' rights. Once Lincoln was president, they simply wanted to be in another country. They didn't trust him. Their leaders was Jefferson Davis was elected as presidency. And, oh, sorry, I'm going to go back. I can't see that because it's under there, but I'm not sure what it says. Is it about it's under one of the, let me see if I can move that up to the other side. Comment. What you can't see is there's a toolbar there that's blocking me. Sorry. President of the United States, and Robert Lee was the, I don't know if it says that. Oh, was their capital in Richmond? Is that what it says? And Robert Lee was their general. On the other side, you had the Unionists. They were from the northern states where slavery was illegal. This is in places like New York, Massachusetts, Illinois. So New York is in the state of New York, as you know. Boston in Massachusetts, Boston's the capital. And Chicago's in Illinois, although it's not the capital. And what did they believe in? Well, they believed that slavery should be banned throughout the United States of America. And they also believed that the country should be united. They didn't want the country to split into two over the issue of slavery. Their leader was President Lincoln, and General Ulysses S. Grant, who's a very famous general, was in charge of their army. I'm going to give you a minute just to look at the flags, because I just want you to tell me something about the flags in a moment. I'll just get my notes in order, sorry. Okay, so if you look at these flags, one is the Confederacy. You can see that they're both red, white, and blue, and they've all red, and they've all got white, and they've all got blue, and they've all got stars. Can anyone notice anything different about the Unionist flag? Okay, so I don't know if you did notice this, but the stars are not exactly the same as the US flag now. You see there's one missing there, there's one missing there. That's because each star represents a state, and at this time they didn't have as many states as they have now. So if you look at a flag of the US now, you'll see it's a little bit different. They've had several different flags over the years, and the one they've got now is just the latest version of it. Right, so sorry, I just had to go there, the dog was barking. So what I would like you to consider is how you think you would feel if you were an African-American person in the modern day who was looking at these modern day photos. The first photo there is a picture of a Trump rally in 2015, I think, just before President Trump was elected. And you can see here, we've got the Confederate flag. And this one is also a modern picture of a rally of people who believed in the Confederacy. Now think about what the Confederacy stood for. The Confederacy stood for slave-owning states. So they were a set of states that thought that slavery should continue. And there are people in America, quite a number of people, who still use the Confederate flag to represent themselves. And how would you feel in the context of the Black Lives Matter protest that's been going on across the world recently? How would you feel as an African American in particular if you saw these flags freely on display? What would you think those people who had the flags would think of you? Okay. So the Civil War ended in 1865, but the problems didn't really end there. The Civil War started in 1861, ended in 1865, and the North won. The northern states defeated the southern states. The decisive battle was at Gettysburg, and Abraham Lincoln gave a very famous speech, the Gettysburg Address. And the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, which in theory freed the slaves in the southern states. He also managed to unite the United States of America again, so the Confederacy was over, and it was once again one country. Okay, so now we're looking at this picture here. It's called Jim Crow. It's a 19th century cartoon of a character called Jim Crow, which was a white person who was in blackface. Now, I don't know whether you know what blackface is, but it was when somebody paints their face black. This is an absolutely terrible thing to do, particularly in this day and age. It did happen in the past and it shouldn't have done. But this was in the 19th century. It was a song and dance act, an entertainer, a white person, who claimed that he was inspired by a slave he saw who behaved like this. He would sing silly songs and jump about a bit. And as you can see, he dressed in raggedy clothes. This was in order to poke fun at black people. He was representing what, in his mind, a slave was. So I'd like you to think about, what does this suggest about how white people saw black Americans? And why do you think they depicted Jim Crow in this way? So pause the video. Okay, so obviously they would see black Americans as just a figure of fun, just somebody to laugh at, somebody to have a bit of a joke about. It wasn't a particularly kind representation in the rags and the clogs and the silly dances that he was doing. And the reason that they depicted him in this way was to demean him. That means to make them feel bad about themselves. So to put them in their place. They were just a figure of fun. They shouldn't be taken seriously. Okay, so if you'll remember at the beginning, we said we would talk about the Jim Crow laws, and that time has come. So we're just going to go on this link here. I'm just going to read to you, so sit back and listen. So Jim Crow laws were laws created by white Southerners to enforce legal segregation across the South from the 1870s, and they lasted right through to the 1960s. Under the Jim Crow system, whites only and coloured signs proliferated. That means they grew across the South at water fountains, restrooms, bus waiting areas, movie theatres, swimming pools and public schools. African Americans who dared to challenge segregation, remember segregation was keeping the races apart, they faced arrest or violence. In 1896, a Supreme Court of America, the highest court in the land, declared that Jim Crow segregation was legal. They ruled that separate but equal accommodations African Americans were permitted under the Constitution. Of course, we can imagine that even though the accommodations were separate, all these laws that kept them separate, they weren't equal. We've already seen the difference in the water fountains, and that's a fairly minor thing. So let's learn a bit more about it. Jim Crow segregation was a way of life that combined a system of anti-black laws and race prejudice cultural practices. The term Jim Crow is often used as a synonym. You know what a synonym is, a word that means the same as racial segregation, particularly in the American South. The Jim Crow South was the era during which local and state laws enforced the legal segregation of white and black citizens. In the Jim Crow South, it was illegal for black Americans to ride in front of public buses, eat at white-only restaurants, or attend a white public school. So a school that was a normal public school like Leicester Green, but only white people were allowed to attend it. There was also a more subtle, now we know the word subtle because it's on our spelling list, certainly my group have done the word subtle, it means a hint of. social dimensions to Jim Crow, which required that African Americans demonstrate subservience. That means being like a servant to white people, and showed that they knew that they were inferior to white people at all times. So, for example, a black man who succeeded in business might find his shop burned to the ground by jealous white people. A black woman who failed to step off the pavement to make way for a white man might find herself fired by her employer the following day. A black man who had a relationship with a white woman, so a white girlfriend, might be hanged in the middle of town. And most Southern whites interpreted any claim to pride or equality by African Americans as an affront. That means an insult. So Southern whites interpreted any claim to equality, or if they had pride in themselves, as an insult to them. The term Jim Crow, we know, came from this black character that we've already seen. That's probably a better picture there. From the late 1800s, the name Jim Crow came to signify the social and legal segregation of black Americans from white. After the Civil War and Reconstructions, whites disenfranchised black men. They took away the vote from black men. They did this in a way, not by passing a law, but by making it very difficult for black men to vote. They imposed a poll tax. They had to pay to vote. They had to pass a literacy test. And slaves, people who had been enslaved, had not been educated properly. And as we know, a lot of the schooling was substandard for those black children. They frequently relegated black workers to low-paying jobs, and they poorly funded public schools for black children. In this way, whites in the Jim Crow South crafted a bitter web of political, economic, and social barriers to full and equal citizenship for their black citizens. So although they didn't do it through laws, they did it in a sneakier way and kept black people underneath them. Let's go back. Okay. So, in which part of America, oh sorry, I missed a bit there. Why is that not coming out? No, I don't know why it's missing a smile. Let me just escape from that. Go to the next bit. So here's a list of, hopefully you can see, here's some of the Jim Crow laws, which were in force in the southern states. So no white nurse was allowed to work in a hospital where black people were being treated. In restaurants, it was against the law to serve black and white people in the same room. Black and white people couldn't get married, and black people were not allowed to take books out of libraries. If a black person and a white person, a man and a woman, were found living together, they could be imprisoned for a year and fined. Black people and white people had separate waiting rooms for buses and trains, and obviously the white waiting room was vastly superior. And black and white people had separate drinking fountains. There were separate schools for black and white children, and black people had to give up their seats. So even if they were sitting in an empty seat when they got on, they had to give up that seat on either a train or a bus for a white person if they wanted to sit there. And anyone who was found printing books or leaflets about the rights of black people was imprisoned and fined. Okay, the civil rights movement. As a consequence of the difficulties that black African Americans were facing, the civil rights movement was born. The civil rights movement was a struggle by African Americans that set out to end legalized racial discrimination, disenfranchisement, that means losing the vote, and racial segregation in the United States. Although it began in the late 19th century, it became much more prominent in the mid-20th century, especially in the 1950s and 60s. Some of its most famous leaders from this time include Martin Luther King, who's pictured here, and Malcolm X. This is a very famous march of Martin Luther King. He gave a very famous speech, which we'll look at in more detail later on in a different lesson. But you can see how many people, they are all the way back up here. You can see it's also just like the Black Lives Matter protests at the weekend. It's a mixture of black and white people who were marching for the rights of African Americans. Okay, so these are the questions I'd like you to answer. So you can type your answers, or you can write down your answers and take a photo and upload it to Google Classroom. Either way, don't mind. Or you can handwrite it and upload it, whatever you want to do. In which part of America were the slave-owning states? What was the name of the two sides, or what were the names of the two sides in the US Civil War? Why might the image at the bottom of the page be offensive to African Americans? Explain what the image at the top of the page shows using keywords from the lesson. So the keywords that we had at the beginning of the lesson, use some of those words to describe what that picture at the top shows. And do you think that statues of historical figures such as Edward Colston should be removed? Okay, I need a few lines on that. I'm going to put this PowerPoint up on the stream anyway, and you can have a look at it on there and take your time to go through it. So that's the end of today's lesson. Thank you for joining me.